test.
I don't hear an echo.
Okay, great. You never know. Oops. Because we want to thank tonight's sponsor for this event. It's made possible through a grant that we have from the Indiana Humanities in cooperation with the National Endowment for the Humanities. And we're super grateful for their support and generosity, obviously, to make something like this possible. So now, with no further ado, I will introduce our first speaker of the evening, Chase Haller, our Director of Housing and Consumer Justice at the clinic, who's going to lead us in a discussion of Matthew Desmond's book, Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City. And after that, we'll hear from Kyle Arbuckle, who is graciously here all the way from Washington, D.C., and he is the Housing Advocacy Organizer of the National Low Income Housing Coalition. So he's going to share his perspective on housing justice in Indiana and nationwide after Chase begins. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Chase now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lydia, for introducing me. And thank you, Kyle, for being here with us and everyone else who's with us here this evening. This is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart at the clinic. I've been at the clinic since 2012 in our Housing and Consumer Justice programs. I'm currently the director of our Housing and Consumer Justice programs. I have primarily focused on mortgage foreclosure cases and then also some rent-to-own, land contract, and a lot of landlord-tenant law. This particular book study, I was so glad that I had the opportunity to lead this study. Just because the book Evicted, in terms of the many books that I've read in my life, it's probably one of the most impactful ones in terms of shaping my perspective about the importance of housing and housing policy, and talking about solutions to the housing crisis, which existed far before even this pandemic, which has exacerbated the problem significantly. But I thank you for being here tonight, and I look forward to the conversation. Those of you that know me, you would never pay $10 to listen to me talk for 40 minutes. So I hope this will be a conversation instead. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So thank you again for being here tonight. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen here. Okay. All right, can I get a thumbs up if you guys can see my presentation? Thank you. Okay. So I'm going to start with the ever so unpopular start off with a question to a group of people who don't all know each other. But the question is, why should we care about evictions in our cities and in our state? Why should we care about evictions in our cities and in our state?
I'll go. I was thinking a lot about this question, and this book gutted me. There are just so many things that I didn't realize, but I think that it becomes kind of a huge quality of life issue for people, for kids that are living in this situation, and then it just kind of becomes this domino effect, and it can affect wide swaths of areas where people aren't getting the services and the things that they need. And I think that this this will end up affecting not just those neighborhoods, but the entire city, and just kind of the feel of the city. And we should care also because we should care about our neighbors, and we should be trying to help build up our neighbors and build up these areas and trying to fix these problems and these systemic issues, because it's something that we all benefit from these systems in some degree. Some people don't. Some people are really harmed by them. So those who have benefited from the system should be willing to help those who have been harmed by the system as well.
That's really great. I love what you said about the impact on communities, because and your point, your wider point, I think, was that it touches everything, right? Housing touches everything. It impacts crime rates. It impacts access to food and healthcare and school and job performance. And you hear a term often now, or a phrase, I guess, that's used pretty widely, that housing is healthcare. And that's true all the time, because of how it affects your physical well-being, your emotional well-being as a person, having stability in your housing. But it's particularly true during a pandemic, right? When we're faced with this circumstance where there's a deadly virus, and the more people that get evicted and have to shelter together, it actually creates a danger to their lives. Anyone else have any observations about why we should care about evictions in our cities?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, did somebody say something? I thought I heard somebody talking, but maybe not.
No, I'll go. I think, at the base level, it's expensive. It's
Mhm.
expensive for governments. It's expensive for all of us to, having to provide different services and all of that kind of stuff is, to help people who are either going to be in need of shelters or going to be in need of, other housing or finding places and moving people around. A lot of it is, it's expensive in the court, it's expensive for police, it's expensive for everything. But, and that, some of that takes money away from things that would really help, like transportation and education and infrastructure and all of these things, and better jobs. That, all of these things eventually, for people who I can't convince them that in their hearts that they should care, I can convince them that it costs them money.
Yeah, it's a very good point. And I know Kyle during his presentation is going to really talk through a lot of the dollars and cents. The National Low Income Housing Coalition has done incredible research in this area and has wonderful, great visuals about this. So I'm excited to hearing about that from him. But yeah, thank you for your feedback. That's great.
Chase,
Yeah, sure.
this is Jacqueline. I would just add too that not only would I agree with what the two speakers already have mentioned, but also it's just so timely right now, given everything with COVID and how it's affected so many folks and made making rent payments that much more difficult. And though there's moratoria in place right now, once those are lifted, this is going to be both here locally and probably much as nationally, like it's going to be a huge and major crisis. So I think it's particularly just relevant and timely to care about, not just in general. Like when this book came out, I actually read it a couple of years back, and for a book club of mine, and it was still poignant then, but I just feel like now it's just increasingly so, given the moment that we're in right now.
Yeah, absolutely. There's kind of a timelessness to it, right? And it fits the moment almost. I don't know where you are, Jacqueline, but I want to be where you are. I'm looking outside my window and I'm like, it doesn't look like that here.
San Diego. So yes,
beautiful,
very nice.
Beautiful. Well, thank you for joining us from sunny, beautiful 73-degree all year San Diego. But yeah, I know you're absolutely right. And kind of, I think the other piece of that is that there's often a judgment that we associate with people who face eviction. Oh, this must be, about personal choice, and somebody made bad decisions or something like that. And of course, sometimes that's probably true. But the pandemic has really removed some of that subjectivity or that judgment, because you're talking about millions and millions of people out of work and losing income and still faced with the same bills that they had before. I think it's been helpful to provide some perspective too for people. And so I did want to share with you all a couple of slides. This first slide kind of tracks evictions over time. And this is in particular to Indianapolis, but the website reference there, evictionlab.org, tracks this information. And I find this one really helpful because it looks at a snapshot in time over the course of the pandemic and related to evictions. And you can see when it starts, The first overlay in blue shows when we had a local moratorium in Indiana. So we had a statewide eviction moratorium that didn't allow pretty much any evictions except for emergency evictions. And you can see there was almost no eviction filings for the first few months of the pandemic. That local moratorium ended in August of 2020. And then there was a gap into the CDC moratorium, the national moratorium that was enacted in early September of 2020. And you can see there's I think maybe a misconception that evictions aren't happening. They absolutely are. And you can see that from the data here, but there's over, I think the most recent data is actually showing closer to 900 or so evictions a month, or a month. And that's a lot. That's a lot of people being evicted. And the reason for that is the national moratorium has many exceptions. There's many kind of ways around it. If you have an attorney, you're a landlord, and you can afford to pay an attorney, and most of them do use attorneys in small claims court, they can figure ways around some of these exceptions. And that's led to, and the other part of it is the national moratorium requires action on the part of the tenant as well. It's not automatic protection like the statewide moratorium was. So if the tenant's not aware of their rights, they don't sign a declaration and send it to their landlord, they don't get the protection, period. And even if they do that, there are exceptions to the moratorium that the landlords are taking advantage of. So we've been assisting clients in various circumstances like that, but just wanted to point that out. Another question, and you can actually, it's actually not a question, it's more of a statement. So it's the primary thesis of the book is that eviction is a cause, not just a condition of poverty. So we think of eviction as something that happens to someone who's experiencing poverty, but one of the primary ideas in the book is that it actually causes poverty or perpetuates poverty. And I'm just curious if anyone has an observation from the book where that really hit home for them, or if they have another reflection to that kind of primary theme of the book.
There, I'm Janet, and my background is as a therapist, and that sentence I know struck me when I was reading it in the book. And I didn't realize, the author did such a great job of talking about how there are so many ways evictions come to be. It seemed like a lot of times it was, the police got called, or somebody's neighbor had something happen, or sometimes it didn't even have to do with the family themselves so much as the circumstances that surrounded them. And I just thought that was a really kind of eye-opening revelation to realize that, like, having the eviction notice, just the number of problems that resulted afterwards. I was not aware.
Yeah, and you're kind of hit with that in the beginning of the book, right? With Arlene.
Mm-hmm.
The book opens with her being evicted because a stranger kicked in her door and caused damage to her door, and that resulted in an eviction against her. And then you see that throughout the book, this cyclical nature of, getting passed around, having to stay with friends, having to go here, having to go there. And just thinking about the emotional toll that could take on a person or a family. Ironically, I'm talking about this as I'm sitting in my warm house, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that dose of that lack of my ability to understand necessarily what someone feels like in that situation is why a book like this is so important, because it gives you kind of a window into that perspective that you may not have experienced in your life, right?
Well, and even later on, then when something happened at school between one of the boys and the teacher, and the police followed them home, and then they got evicted because of that. And that, I just feel like there should be some sort of protection you know, that what happens at school should not result in your eviction from your home.
Yeah, and one thing we see in the book is this idea of shadow evictions too, right? So we count all these filings that happen, but what don't get counted are the informal evictions. You know, the landlord showing up and telling somebody you need to get out. I actually had a call probably just before Christmas. It's probably in December or late November, of a prospective client that the landlord took the hinges off the door. One of the tenants hadn't paid. It was, I think, there was 4 different roommates, and one of them hadn't paid their share of the rent, and the landlord came and took the door off the hinges and told them all to get out. And you don't think of that as something that could possibly happen, but we get those calls, so we know it does happen, right? And it is illegal. I mean, we've had circumstances where we've had to file emergency cases to place people back into possession and things like that. But once somebody's out in the street or they've moved on to the next thing, the idea that they would have the ability and the energy to figure out how to access the courts is a whole nother question. Any other observations about this kind of theme of the book?
Chase, I was going to say this quote reminds me of how he detailed this with pretty much everyone he followed, just the way an eviction compounds and like starts a domino effect of all these different costs that are either like affect you like internally, like emotionally, or literally financially, like the woman who had to store all her stuff at the U-Haul center, but that got too expensive and then she had to go to other places. And then the woman who lost her child because she couldn't she lost custody of her child because she couldn't afford a home to house the child. So just like this domino effect of all these different indicators of poverty from stemming from an eviction.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you see that eviction becomes kind of a scarlet letter for people, right?
For sure.
Meaning, 8 out of the 10 places they apply are going to deny them because they have a recent eviction. Well, who are those 2 out of the 10? They're usually, the one that's looking to look the other way. Maybe it's the house isn't in great shape that they're renting, so they're not too picky. And it can be, a situation where they end up renting a pretty uninhabitable or not a quality home either, which leads to other problems. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit as a theme about power disparities. A couple of recent reports, both from the National Council of State Housing Agencies and Indianapolis Neighbor Housing Partnership, kind of estimate what this huge backlog in unpaid rent looks like. The National Council of State Housing Agencies estimated $34 billion in past due rent payments being owed by January of this year. And that same report estimated 150,000 eviction filings in Indiana in that same time frame. And then the INHP, which is a local community partner of ours that does a lot of pre-purchase housing counseling and things like that, they commissioned a report in August that suggested that 22% of all renter households in Marion County were at heightened risk of foreclosure as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And importantly as well, that there was very likely to be a disparate impact on households of color, which makes this a racial justice issue as well. And I'll have another illustration for you as well later on that point. I found a case that talks about this power disparity between the landlord and the tenant. And the judge in this opinion says, a tenant must live somewhere. The tenant has no meaningful choices. He can accept this landlord or go to another landlord who charges the same rent and ask the tenant to sign the same standard lease. In other words, the modern standard form lease is in essence an adhesion contract. And funny enough, now that I'm reading this quote, I'm realizing I have an old version of the PowerPoint running, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second and pull up my my more recent one. So bear with me just a second. Sorry, guys. Because I had a better quote for that one. I'm looking at a different one here. So, all right, sorry about that. Let me pull this up. All right. Okay. All right. So in terms of percentage of income spent on housing, when you look at this diagram, it shows you the percentage of poor renting households and what percentage of their income that they spend on housing. And over 40%, 50% of low-income households spend more than half of their income on housing. Now, there are plenty of examples of government programs and things like that, foreclosure, or excuse me, mortgage affordability surveys, things like that, that suggest that around 30% of household income is technically affordable. So anytime somebody's paying more than 30% of their income, that's considered, that they have a high rent burden. So, and I know Kyle's going to share some information on this, but there's a pretty significant disparity there. To talk about the racial justice implications of evictions, we created a tool back in November of 2020 to help people apply for CDC moratorium protection. It's called indierenterhelp.org. People go there, they put their information in, it'll send a declaration to their landlord and prevent eviction for non-payment of rent. Sorry, I'm not sure what's going on here. Having an issue with my slides. So I should have about 30 slides, but it looks like this version I'm opening didn't save properly. Lydia, might it make sense for me to try and find the proper version of this? And I don't know if we want to move on to Kyle and then I can come back to it, or what the best thing is, but I need to make sure I'm using the right document. I'm sorry for the delay, but.
No problem. Yeah, I think if that's okay with Kyle, if you want to just jump on in and we'll have the bookends with the book. Sounds good to
Sure.
me.
Yep. Pull up my slides now. Excuse me. You can see that, right?
It's not, it doesn't, oh yeah, there you go.
Okay. Yep. Excuse me. Okay, so yeah, my name's Kyle Arbuckle. I'm a housing advocacy organizer with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Excuse me. We are a advocacy nonprofit based in DC, focused on achieving socially just policy that ensures people with the lowest incomes in the United States have affordable and decent homes. So our main mission is to end homelessness and housing insecurity. And so part of my role is to work with our state partners in Indiana through the Southeast region. And so I work closely, many of you might know Prosperity, Indiana. So I work closely with them to advance our priorities at the state levels, local level as well. And then they assist us in our federal advocacy by engaging with key congressional members. So what guides our work is the GAP. That is a research report we do annually that details the shortage of affordable and available housing to extremely low-income renter households. And so currently there is a shortage of 7 million rental homes affordable and available to all extremely low-income renter households. And so this chart, I'm going to go over this kind of in detail because this is probably the most crucial part of our work. So you'll see at the bottom of both sides of this graph, those are on the left, the number of extremely low-income renter households, and then the number of affordable and available units. Affordable units to that bracket. And you'll see that it's the only one that doesn't match up in that there are fewer red for the other red. Whereas with all the other income brackets, you'll see they can dip into these lower income units, whereas extremely low income renters cannot go higher up, or if they do, they face eviction often because they cannot keep up with the rent. And so to make it more simple, for every 100 renter households, there are only 36 affordable and available rental homes. And that goes up gradually in income bracket. So you'll see that the shortage is most absolute and noticeable for extremely low income renter households, but also low income as well. And so I wanted to talk about what that looks like in Indiana. These are one of our state housing profiles that details a lot of different statistics about rental housing in Indiana. One of my favorite charts is the one on the left. You'll see here, the circle chart. There's a prevailing narrative that, extremely low income renters are lazy, what have you, that type of pathology. But you'll see that almost half are in the labor force, and then almost a quarter are disabled, and then almost another quarter are seniors. So extremely low income renters either work or cannot work. I know in my own work, I engage regularly with low income renters, and many of them are on SSI, SSDI, and I'm sure many of you probably know that as well in your work. So, and then in the state of Indiana, there are only 38 affordable and available homes for every 100 extremely low income renter households, and then that number goes up to 77 for low income. That's so at 50% AMI. And then on the right, you see the housing cost burden, which Chase kind of got into about how much of your income you spend on rent. And we see that, as you keep going lower and lower in the income bracket, more and more people are more cost burden, and then also severely cost burden. And we see how it jumps from very low income to extremely low income from 19% are severely cost burden to 71%. So extremely low income renters, it's the old adage that poverty is expensive because they are paying more with less. So this is another cool fact sheet that we have. This is a congressional district profile of the 5th district, which actually where I grew up. I grew up in Carmel, Indiana, so the north side of Indianapolis. And you can see that in the top right, that details the shortage there. So for every 100 extremely low income renters, there's only 26 affordable and available homes. So that's lower than the state average and the national average as well. And then you can see the different metro areas as well, the rental affordability statistics, but I will get into that in a later slide. I have another report to talk about that. And then this is the 7th district. So this is largely Indianapolis. Numbers it's actually lower, but not too much different. It's 22 for every 100 extremely low income renters. What's something I thought interesting about this is that renters make up 48% of all households in this district, which makes the eviction problem so much more pernicious in a place like Indianapolis, where there's so many renters and there's so many poor renters, and there's just not enough housing for them. So that's why we've seen the unfortunate problem that we have there. And then this is from our out of reach report. This report talks about how there's nowhere in the country where a person can afford a 2-bedroom fair market rent apartment making minimum wage. So in the state of Indiana, you'd have to make $16.30 to afford that. And the minimum wage is obviously not that, although obviously recently House Democrats have talked about, and Senate Democrats have talked about including that. So we're hopeful for that. And then on the bottom left, you can see the different housing wages for each area. So Indianapolis is higher than the state average, $18. And then something else for more context on the right, you'll see here, you'd have to work 90 hours a week at minimum wage to afford a 2-bedroom fair market rent apartment, and then 73 hours to afford a 1-bedroom. So Chase also talked about this a little bit. We're seeing an eviction cliff coming on. The moratoriums have been pretty patchwork, and so they haven't stopped all evictions, but they've been able to stabilize them at some point. But if we don't see any more rental assistance doled out, we were thankful to get 25 billion in December, but if we don't see more come out, there will be a huge cliff. We did an estimate that it could cost the public up to $129 billion in social services. And I think someone mentioned that earlier when we were having our discussion about why we should care about evictions. The huge moral cost to society is enough, but there's a huge financial cost as well. And then this is just a map of some where the rental assistance programs are across the country. Like I said, they're pretty patchwork, and in my next slide, I'll go into some of the issues with this, but I think it sounds like people are calling in from all over the place. So if you're interested in learning more about the rental assistance programs in your state, feel free to contact me. We have a spreadsheet at the bottom. I don't think you can click on that, but I'm happy to share that with anybody who's interested in it. And we've done a lot of research on the rental assistance programs in the country. And as I mentioned before, it sounds like a broken record, but they're pretty patchwork. They ask a lot of renters often. Many times landlords aren't taking the money. Few programs actually target extremely low income renters. And so unfortunately, higher income people are taking some of the rental assistance. Not that they don't need it, but yeah, there's been some issues with the way it's been doled out. Excuse me. And so yeah, more help is needed. We have found that out of the 438 programs, 3 out of 10 are closed. I'm often finding in a lot of rural areas, we're finding a lot of closures and no word on when the help is coming. So we're working really hard right now to make sure that everyone who needs rental assistance can get it. That's one of our big priorities for 2021. And so I mentioned that $25 billion was just passed in the last CARES relief package. That'll be distributed via the coronavirus relief fund. And then 90% of those funds must be used for payment of rent and rent arrears to address that backlog that Chase and I both talked about. And then the good thing is it can support someone for up to 18 months of back rent. So can get people out of a really big hole. And so we've been working closely with the Biden administration before they took office, and obviously now, just making sure that our priorities are included in a lot of his plans. He said on the campaign trail that he wanted vouchers to be an entitlement. As of now, only 1 out of 4 people that need rental assistance get it, and he promised to close that gap. And so we're hoping to hold him accountable to that. And so you'll see in the first 100 days, we're asking for $30 billion more rental assistance, and then $28 billion in housing choice vouchers for longer term assistance to people, and then $6.1 billion in emergency solution grant money, which would go to homeless service providers. And then thankfully, they extended the eviction moratorium to March 31st. But as Chase mentioned, it's been kind of a disaster how it's played out. And so we're asking for it to be no onus on the tenant to do anything, and it's just automatic and universal as well. And so some of our long-term goals with the Biden administration are to just increase the amount of funding for the most critical programs. So the housing choice vouchers program, the renter's tax credit, which would basically help lower income renters afford to live in places that they probably couldn't before. And then we also want to expand the supply of housing. I think that's where there's a kind of a connection between Chase and I's presentations, in that if you don't have enough housing, if you don't have somewhere else to go, and you're facing an eviction, that's what leads to, you know, just a cycle of homelessness and housing insecurity. And it makes housing more expensive when there's not enough of it. So, and then, yeah, these are just some really long-term goals. You know, we believe that increasing the amount of housing available and affordable to extremely low-income renters would address climate change, and then have an equitable disaster recovery plan. And then we also want to address fair housing and racial income inequity. And so this is just our call to action. We, you know, fully believe that evictions are, you know, shouldn't happen anyway, and they definitely should not happen now. As Chase mentioned, housing is health, and you know, we are actively working to lobby Congress and the White House to pass a CARES package, another one, and I believe the timeline now is they're shooting for February. And so if you're interested in doing some more advocacy around that, please feel free to contact me. I'd love for you to join us. We are a membership organization, so feel free to ask me about that if you have any questions about that. There's a link at the bottom. You can see where you can join it to be a member. We don't provide any real benefits, but people, you know, like to support our work, and we will respond to people that are members more quickly and call on them to do more actions for us. And then this is my contact info if anybody has any questions or anything or wants to get in touch.
Kyle, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
I'm curious from your perspective of like, have you seen any really creative solutions on like a national scale or in other cities around like housing, like the lack of units, or like I even think about the number of vacant homes in Indianapolis, and yet there's not enough housing. Like, I'm just curious from your perspective of what you guys are seeing, if there's any creative solutions being tried at least.
Yeah, so the vacant home one is one I hear a lot, and I'm also interested in that too. But the problem with vacant homes is that they're very, very expensive to remodel often, because they've often had years of neglect, and they take a lot of time as well. It can work though. There are plenty of, I think Baltimore has, you know, $1 buyback program where you can buy the land that the house is on and then it's yours. But like I said, you have to do repairs and stuff for that. You know, I venture to say that there isn't really many places do it. We have a huge housing crisis, a housing shortage crisis, and it's hard to say that there are a lot of good things happening. I think that there's more consciousness about it. At least I've seen. You know, Bernie Sanders made it every debate in the presidential debate. He mentioned that there are 500,000 homeless people on the street every night. Elizabeth Warren made housing a key part of her platform. Castro was the former HUD secretary, and Joe Biden mentioned that he would want to make housing vouchers universal. So I believe that there's more of a consciousness around how this is a systemic issue, and treating it like a systemic issue, like food or, you know, things like that. Some specific examples, I would say, you know, a lot of places, I know DC has a housing trust fund, so a dedicated fund to housing. I don't believe Indianapolis has one. I think the state does, but I don't believe the city does. So having a dedicated source that's specifically for creating, you know, rental housing for low-income people, I think is important. You know, we see, in my opinion, far too often kind of the middle market programs, and I don't believe that government really needs to be doing that. I think that the market can, you know, solve out that middle market housing. I think they need to be focusing on people that need deep subsidy, like low income people and extremely low income people. Does that answer your question, Kate? I'm sorry.
It does. I just think it's an interesting piece of thinking about, especially with the eviction piece and thinking about evicted in the book, even like of that there's more than just the like rental units. There's also mortgages and like foreclosure issues on
Sure.
that side. And wondering about like too, like I think it's just a bigger systemic questions often, I think in my mind, of like, what about all these people that own these big properties who aren't getting paid rent? Like there's so much like dominoes that we see coming but have already been in place for, as we're seeing through the book, for years. So but yeah, thanks Kyle, I appreciate it.
Yeah, I think that you know, we fully see the benefit to property managers and housing providers that rental assistance is how they're going to survive too. So we've been putting a lot of that in our messaging. So yeah.
Kyle, can I ask a question too?
Sure.
Did I hear you say that some property managers are refusing these COVID relief funds, this rental assistance that's been ongoing?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't have like too many specific examples. I've just heard enough of it for it to catch my eye. I think part of that could be some, personal conflict between the tenant and the landlord. And maybe they've been late before and they don't want to, put up with this tenant anymore. So yeah, and I know that the state of Idaho actually was going to reject the rental assistance funding from the government. So there's been some of that too. I know that it's just, yeah, like I said, it's just been a huge mess. And then even states that do accept it, there's a big administrative burden to doling out the money if they don't have the infrastructure in place. You're just given a couple $2 billion and you've never managed that much money before, and now you're asked to create a rental assistance program. A lot of places just weren't equipped to do that. So yeah, we're really hopeful that in the next round of funding, so the $25 billion that passed in December, we can see some better results. But yeah.
And then if it's okay to ask a second question, I was just
For
curious
sure.
how Indianapolis compares. You talked about the, if I get it right, extreme low income population and the availability of units. How does Indianapolis compare to like a Chicago or a New York? Or
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, Indianapolis is up there. Let me look I can look very quickly at where the state of Indiana ranks at least. And then you saw on that the congressional district slide, so Andre Carson's district, so pretty much Indianapolis. There were only 22 affordable and available homes for every 100 extreme low income renters versus 36 at the national level. So yeah, pretty low. And that's for a number of reasons. I think, the eviction rate in Indianapolis is really high. So I think if people are, poverty kind of sustains itself in a place like Indianapolis, unfortunately. There aren't, good like long-term jobs for those people either. So they're having trouble paying, like if they do have a job, paying rent. But, the cost of living in the city has gone up a little bit. So there aren't as many low-paying jobs, and even the ones that they do have, they're not enough to afford to live there. So yeah, I think it's a confluence of things. But yeah, I'll look really quickly to see where
And then,
Indiana ranks.
to answer your question about some of the reasons we've heard why landlords aren't accepting it, I've heard, like, for example, the Indianapolis rental assistance program requires the landlord to register under the landlord registry. It asks them to not evict the tenant within 45 days and consider them current. So it has some strings attached that make some landlords, for whatever reason, skeptical of acceptance, or they don't want to have the government looking over their shoulder kind of attitude. But that's most of what we heard. And then actually, the more major issue that came up in the fall was that the money wasn't enough. These programs were designed initially for 2 or 3 months of payment assistance, and by the time we got to even really August, September, we had people with balances that were $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, and the maximum amount of assistance is $1,200 over 3 months. Whereas the most recent Indiana announcement is that, to Kyle's point about the differences, it's going to allow repayment of up to 12 and even I think 15 months of assistance payments. So it seems like they've redesigned it to be a little bit more broad, which is good.
Yeah, it's a great point, Chase. Megan, to answer your question, Indiana, the state of Indiana is just 2 above the national level. So, yeah.
thank you.
Yep.
I have a question about your point about funding going to truly low income housing,
Mhm.
affordable housing.
Sure.
I know there's a lot of Section 42 housing going going up in Indianapolis, lots and lots of apartments. But when I've looked into these apartments, I don't really think the rents are affordable for people even making the $16 an hour that you indicated earlier. So there was a lot of conversation, about public transportation, like the Red Line, that there was going to be development and affordable housing. Most of those projects do seem to be Section 42, but those rents don't really seem to fit your categories for being affordable. So can you speak to that? Because I'm not quite sure how that all works and how people are able to get, federal tax credits for affordable housing that's really quite expensive.
Yeah, and I think the issue is, affordable to who? That's the question that we always have of, are the AMI brackets really a good indicator? Because they're also based off the entire area. They're not granular. So that property that you're looking at, it could be affordable. I live in DC and the median income is, I think, 117,000. And so 60% of that is whatever it is. It's high. So, it's affordable to who is my question. I think what we see as a solution to that is there are a lot of programs that are already in place. We've demonized public housing for so long, but I believe that was more of a mismanagement issue, and building it in segregated ways that we did. And, we have a backlog now of, I believe, $75 billion in maintenance for public housing. But that's a program that specifically targets, people that need housing. And then also housing choice vouchers. There's an issue with those as well, even though they do target low income people, just like the rental assistance issue. In many places you can deny someone, you can deny their application to rent your apartment if you don't like the source of their income, which would be a voucher. A lot of places have already outlawed that. DC recently re-upped theirs that you can't even advertise that you don't take Section 8 because a lot of landlords were doing that. So I guess what I'm trying to say, my point is, enforcing the low income housing programs that already exist, and utilizing those and investing in those. That's easier said than done. I think at this point, a lot of PHAs and city governments like the tax credit housing program because it's pretty easy. You don't have to do a lot of planning with it. It's mainly private developers doing whatever they want, and then they just get some off the top. But I think, it's pushing government leaders to actually use programs like a housing trust fund, like I mentioned earlier, or public housing, or vouchers, or something like that.
Well, to piggyback off of that, Kyle, the city of Indianapolis tried to pass source of income discrimination protection maybe a year ago, 2 years ago, and then the state legislature outlawed it. Essentially, they got wind of it, and the state legislature passed a statute that does not allow municipalities to pass source of income discrimination statutes. So it's prohibited statewide now. So one city attempting to, solve a problem turned into making it a worse problem for the rest of the state. And we see that being played out now again in our state house, unfortunately. But that is the reality of the environment that we're in here. So anyway, that's an area for advocacy, though, because the idea with a voucher is you're supposed to be able to travel with it. That's the entire
Exactly.
purpose.
Yeah.
If you're going to completely defund public housing and let the private market let people use a voucher, that's great until everyone refuses them because of the stigma associated with voucher holders. And we hear that all the time. I don't have anywhere to go. I mean, I'm in this place that won't pass an inspection, and I can't find another place that'll accept a voucher. What is that person supposed to do?
Yeah.
They're going to lose their voucher if they can't find a place to go. So it's a pretty acute problem.
I hate to be, I don't want to use Europe as like the model for something, but just as a point of reference, we looked at a recent report that came out of Amsterdam, and there was, like the word stigma was the biggest thing, is that there was no stigma attached to having a housing choice voucher. And so, like you said, I think that's a really big area of advocacy is, it's just rent as anyone else would spend it. So yeah, I think it's a great point that that's an area of advocacy to destigmatize it and quite literally outlaw that ability to turn that away on its face. Yeah. Also, I know I threw a lot of numbers, and so if anybody wants those slides or anything or any clarification, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to do so. And I see Lydia, I think is going to pass it on to Chase now.
Thank you so much, Kyle. And thank you all for your patience as well. I'm really sorry for that snafu. I'm using a new laptop and, what are you going to do? Okay. So this might jump around slightly. Okay, everybody see my screen all right? Okay. So I think what I was talking about, and I think this is where I noticed that my slides were messed up, so I apologize for that. But I was talking about this tool and the racial disparities of evictions. And so we put this tool out there, and I want to share this chart with you. So the data that we've gathered so far as of Wednesday of this week is that, let's see, roughly 3 times the amount of users identify as people of color. It's African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, American Indian, or Pacific Islander. And that's 75% of the overall users. So, I mean, it's a small sample size, but of the people who are facing eviction and seeking help from our site, that's what the breakdown of users looks like in terms of the disparity between people of color and people who look like me. And back to this question of, what do we know about some of the effects of foreclosure on people and on households? We know that people have a 15% higher likelihood of being laid off if they've experienced a recent eviction. We saw this example with, I think it was Arlena with the housing authority issue in the book, where she owed a past debt to a housing authority, and that kept her from being able to apply for assistance again in the future. So she didn't have access to those programs anymore. In the following year, or in the year following an eviction, families have a 20% higher level of material hardship, lack of access to food, medical care, utilities, paying for their prescriptions, all of those things. And we talked about the kind of cyclical nature of renting from worse and worse landlords. So I wanted to talk about this power disparity issue, getting back to focus on the book. In what ways are there power disparities that play out between landlords and tenants? Like, how do we see examples of that in the book? Do any of you recall some of those kind of power struggles between landlord and tenant? Or how, I guess the better way of phrasing it is, what examples in the book are there of landlords abusing that power?
Chase, one example that I recall is the landlord Sharina talking about my money's longer than yours. Just the idea of being able to outlast in the midst of just the process of letting whatever that legal process might look like, being able to outlast the tenant because she's just got more capital at her disposal at that time.
Right, absolutely.
I also thought there were 2 examples that stick out to me. And the one that horrified me the most was the issue with the domestic violence. That if a woman or a victim who is being abused calls the police, then the landlord may use that against them later on. So then in some ways they're sort of encouraged not to call the police and report violence against them, which just was one of the saddest and one of the worst things that I've read so far. And then in the trailer park where the people were speaking out against the conditions, and so he kind of went through one by one. The Tobin went through one by one, and he was kind of kicking out the people who had spoken against him, even though they may not have been nearly as behind on their rent or some of their monies owed as some of the other people who didn't speak out, who had his back.
Well, it's the ultimate power, right? To be able to tell someone, I own your circumstances, right? If I press this button and send this case to court, even though you only owe me $150, you'll be out in the street, right? It's a pretty powerful abuse of, well, it's an abuse of power. And I think the trailer park was also kind of the most glaring example for me when I think it was Pam and Lenny, or sorry, Pam and Ned were offered the handyman special trailer, right? The fixer upper, right? It's free, right? So all you're doing is renting the land underneath. The only catch is the trailers are junk, right? So, and also they happen to be impossible to move. So even though you own them, it'll cost you over $1,000 to pay somebody to haul it to a new trailer park. So inevitably he would evict them and then reclaim the trailer as abandoned property when they left, right? Just turning them over. So using that lure of the handyman special of something free to draw people in to then charge them, I thought was pretty awful as well. And then of course the impact of the demand for low-income housing too makes it so, he knows he can put somebody in there the next day. So what does he care, if they end up getting evicted? So, yeah, that's not great. Anyone else have any thoughts or ideas about this or other examples from the book they wanted to kind of reflect on?
Chase, one I
The
thought
one
it
that
was,
you-
oh, sorry.
The one that you noted about, hey, I've got 10 more people that could take this unit. That's a big power thing right there. But and I actually own a couple of rental properties, but it's a side gig for us. And that's one of the things I noticed, that, those who do it for a living versus those who just kind of do it as a side gig, there's a big difference in how the landlords treat the tenants. At least I would hope so. That's the way we're of the opinion. I never want to evict anyone because it's a pain, because there's a lot of work that has to be done before I put in the next tenant. Whereas they're like, we don't have to do anything. We'll find somebody who will take it.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to everybody loses in eviction, right? I mean, that's why they're bad for communities. The landlord loses. There are bad tenants that cause damage to property too. I mean, we can't ignore that. But when an eviction happens, we should consider that a loss, just like we do foreclosure. We tend to look at homeowners with this different lens than we do renters, and I think that we need to get out of that way of thinking, because everybody needs a place, a safe, clean, habitable place to live, regardless of what their income level is. And some people don't have the income level to support owning a home. So, yeah. So this question also goes to the power disparity in court. Why do you think that 90% of landlords are represented by attorneys in housing courts while 90% of tenants are not? And what would you do if you were facing eviction and in need of legal assistance?
Access, I think. A lot of tenants don't really have access to resources to help them, especially within minority communities. And landlords, as we see in the book, are required to go through trainings, and there are a lot of extra resources for them to learn about how to deal with mold, or how to deal with this kind of tenant, or what to do in this situation. And specifically in the book, it covers how a lot of the tenants don't really have the knowledge or the access to these resources. And if they do, then a lot of them will say, oh, well, have you asked your family? I think specifically with Lorraine's instance, when she was being evicted, I just remember reading how she called a church and how she called a nonprofit organization, and they asked her, well, do you have anybody else? Whereas landlords, I feel, have those resources pretty readily available.
Yeah, and I think part of it too is if it's a cost to them, they can pass that cost on to their tenants, right? And build it into the amount that they charge for rent if the market will allow it. Whereas the tenant, like you think of the example of, I forget which person it was. I think it was Lamar in chapter 2. He had $78 left for the rest of the month after he paid his rent. Nobody's going to be able to afford a lawyer, you know, with $78 left for food and all the other necessities that they need to buy for the month. And, you know, when you look at even the federal poverty guidelines and you think about, you know, even what that means for families that are 250% of federal poverty, not even people that are considered, you know, 125% or below, which is who we serve. You still struggle to imagine that a family making that amount of money could afford an attorney to deal with a legal issue. So it's kind of, it brings up another question. So evictions are civil in nature, right? They're not criminal. So you have no right to an attorney in eviction court. And so the question that's posed, and Matt Desmond talks a little bit about this with some of the programs that are out there or that were piloted around that time. But do you think attorneys should be provided to low-income tenants at no cost? I see a yes in the chat.
Say yes.
Yeah, there's probably this might be one of those leading questions where most people agree it probably should. I mean, it costs money, right? Is the bottom line that probably makes some people uncomfortable. Is it would cost a lot of money to run a program like this, but the cost savings on the other, like social safety net and things like that, have to be factored into those kind of conversations as well. I know Families First. I saw them quoted. They're a local organization, does emergency transitional housing, lots of other services. They were quoted in an article a couple days ago, and they said they're turning 10 families away a day. And the predominant reason for people seeking the help is that they're facing an eviction. So thinking about the stress that's putting on all the social safety net as well, when people get evicted, it actually costs money. It's the same concept as using the housing first model to deal with homelessness, right? That you provide what that person needs, the housing, so that they can deal with the other pieces of the other issues that they're dealing with a stable roof over their head. Any other thoughts on this? I'm going to show you guys some stats on a recent project.
I was going to say you're probably going to get into this, but I know we've seen so many studies that have shown it pays itself off by limiting people being homeless and having to go into social and using social services, things like that.
Yeah, I bet there's probably some really in-depth studies on that. You guys probably have some. You guys usually are a good repository for that kind of stuff.
No. I think it was in New York I saw, because they have right to counsel now, and
gotcha.
They were seeing a really good payoff. So yeah.
Well, what I was going to reference was, and this has kind of been making the rounds in some circles for housing advocates, is Cleveland's Right to Counsel project. So it started kind of in the middle of the pandemic in July 2020. I imagine it was probably funded with a combination of things, probably some CARES Act money, and then I think it was a big United Way project up in the Cleveland area. And in the first 6 months of that project, they reported recently that they were able to avoid an eviction or an involuntary move 93% of the time. So either that person was able to stay housed or do a voluntary soft landing kind of move out. And 83% got more time to move, impacted over 700 children under the age of 18. So pretty awesome statistics. And particularly when you couple right to counsel programs with rental assistance, I think then you get a really great impact, because now you've got an additional tool to work the situation out with the landlord that the tenant may struggle to know how to apply, or may not even know it's available. And you combine that with representation in court and their ability to kind of deal with that legal process, and it can really help. When I first started the clinic, the primary program that I worked under was a mortgage foreclosure settlement conference. And the reason that it worked so well is because we had hardest hit fund money. We had money that could be used to get those people back on their feet. And that helped work out the vast majority of cases. But having a legal counsel involved in the process to make sure the court's aware of that and can, slow the process down so the person can apply and get the assistance really helps. But I think this Cleveland Right to Counsel project is a really awesome example of how the right to counsel model can really do some pretty awesome things. I know there's been similar, I think in Brooklyn or some areas in New York, there's been some housing court programs like this that follow the kind of housing court or right to counsel model. So it's one idea to kind of stem the bleeding from some of the eviction crisis. So this is a question that comes up a lot, because what we see often are, and you see examples of this in the evicted book as well, are negligent landlords. So landlords that aren't keeping up properties, mold, rodents, bed bugs, I mean, all kinds of really horrible things. And the question is, and this is another power disparity question, why might a low-income tenant be afraid to ask for repairs or to complain to the health department or even seek legal help? This might be one of those that kind of answers itself, perhaps, with the power disparity question. But somebody wrote in the chat, Harper, thank you, landlord retaliation. Yeah. So you think about it in this power dynamic, like we've been talking about. If they can find a reason to evict you and you're a squeaky wheel, then maybe they were looking past the fact that you had a dog and weren't supposed to, or you've got someone living there temporarily that shouldn't be there. But now that you've complained and asked for a repair, now you're a problem tenant, and I'm going to file, an eviction based on breach of contract, or once you're past your grace period, I'm going to file an eviction instead of giving you the grace that I normally would have before. So yeah, retaliatory eviction does happen. When I said there's examples of legal bills and things like that playing out, where a city tries to do something to help and the state, interferes with that. You've probably seen news reports, if you're here locally, about how that's playing out in our state house in Indiana right now. The city of Minneapolis had passed an anti-retaliation statute last summer, and it actually made it illegal to do exactly this. If you're a landlord, to file an eviction if a tenant filed a complaint with the health department or sought legal help or took other protected action. And the city had only prosecuted 6 cases, I think, officially over the course of several months. And the state house, the governor had vetoed the bill that the state house had tried to basically, let me see if I can phrase this in the best way. So the city passed the ordinance with the protections. Again, in the state legislature, they tried to make it illegal for cities to pass those types of protections. The governor vetoed the bill in March, and he said it's not the right time for this type of a statute. Now that they're back in session, the Senate just passed just had an override vote on the governor's veto, and now it's in the House. So if they override his veto, it will invalidate this ordinance that the city passed last summer. So in terms of areas for advocacy, those are the things to be on the lookout for. Is what the state and city government doing, helping tenants, or is it hurting tenants? And in a balanced way, of course. But if you need to identify who your legislators are and see how they vote on issues like that and make your voice heard. I won't lobby. I'm not going to tell you that they should pass this law or that law in this setting here. But as an individual, I'm going to call my legislature on my own time, or my legislator on my own time, and tell them how I feel about the votes that they're taking. And you all should feel empowered to do that too. Now, and the reason I'm showing you these pictures is these are some of the pictures that were shown by one of the state legislators who was arguing they shouldn't override the veto. This is actually a north side apartment complex that's you might be surprised to learn is just a few miles away from Indianapolis's most affluent suburbs. So some of these places you wouldn't notice if you're driving down the street, but they were showing some of these pictures over the course of before they took votes. And I had received a call from someone recently that over the course of the winter, they've had as many as 17 no heats at one time where people didn't have heat at all. Some of the units are completely abandoned, like this one where there's basically trees and shrubbery kind of growing in the apartment. I represented a client in this that was in this development a year or so ago, year and a half ago, with a severe mold water intrusion issue. Almost every one of the units has water intrusion problems and all kinds of systemic issues. And you might be surprised to learn they're organized as a nonprofit too, for tax credit benefits and things like that. So there's a whole host of things like that. But you wouldn't know if you were driving down the street that the place looked like this. And so it's one of those things that, advocates need to be aware of these situations and advocating for consequences for landlords that exude that kind of behavior. They're one of the few apartment complexes in that area that's affordable, and that's why people can't afford to move out. And then they feel stuck in this situation where they can't ask for repairs and they can't move. The other thing I wanted to show you was the rent to own industry, which is kind of what we might call Indianapolis's handyman special, right? And so legislation is, our laws are different around the country on rent to own issues. They're particularly bad here. There aren't clearly drawn lines in some of our statutes as to what's a rental versus a purchase. And so what a lot of these companies do is they live in between. They say, oh, well, you're renting and buying, and therefore, you're in charge to fix it up and things like that. And we've litigated a lot of these kind of cases. This was a client of mine several years ago, and with one of these rent to own companies. And by the way, all the structure and the plumbing you see that's in there, pretty much they built. So this is basically kind of a bare walled place with no floors. And they got behind because they were sinking tons of money into putting in capital improvements into something that they shouldn't have had to put capital improvements into. It should have been habitable in the first place. In chapter 6, we see examples of this in the book too, right? In chapter 6, the Hingston family is forced to accept substandard housing after Sharina files an eviction against them. What rights do you think tenants have to ensure they have safe, quality housing? So I'm curious what all protections you all are aware of, or maybe you're curious about that we could talk about.
It seems like they do have the ability to call, code enforcement, who can get out there. But then the problem is that their landlords, while they can't retaliate against them for that, which is some protection, they can retaliate against them for other things, like having somebody there that they shouldn't, or, being behind on their rent when they were working with them. So they're very much disincentivized to call or try to get any work done on their place.
Somebody wrote code enforcement can kick them out too. And that's a interesting observation, because I'm trying to remember if there's an example of this in the book or not. But I've heard this from clients directly, where they're concerned that when the health department does an inspection, that they're actually gonna, I think the term is red tag it, or basically tell them it's uninhabitable and they have to leave. And so they're afraid to do that. But yeah, I do find that the health department, particularly in Marion County, is a really effective tool. Another interesting aside, there's a bill there's a bill working its way through that will reduce the total amount of fines that landlords may have to pay by like a few 100%, and also prevent health departments from charging fines against individual units. So if they levied a fine, they could only levy a fine against the entire apartment complex. They couldn't cite multiple units and fine for that, for those multiple violations. So that example I gave of 17 no heats over the course of the winter, that would be one fine of, instead of potentially up to $7,500, I think $750 or something, which, you know, they're not going to care about that. I haven't talked much about Indiana statutes. We do have statutory protections for basic systems, plumbing, heating and cooling, hot and cold water. A tenant can file in court to enforce those obligations. I will tell you, in the time that I've been doing landlord-tenant work, I've maybe seen one tenant who knew that they had to provide notice, that they had to give a reasonable amount of time for the landlord to fix it, and then filed a lawsuit and obtained damages on their own. I don't know if I've ever seen more than one example of a tenant being able to navigate the court process. So the justice issue there is access to courts and understanding of how to access a remedy that they're entitled to under the law. Another one is fair housing protections, right? So discrimination is still prohibited at the federal level and at the state level. The federal level, you've got your 7 protected classes. We do have a fair housing center in Central Indiana. It's called the Fair Housing Center of Central Indiana, that accepts complaints and enforces fair housing laws. They file lawsuits against housing providers. One of the big areas is familial status. A lot of times people don't realize, and you see this a lot in the book, right? The landlords that are refusing to rent to someone because they have kids. That's illegal housing discrimination. If a landlord tells somebody, we're not renting to you because you've got children. I had a client call me one time that the landlord knew she was pregnant, and the landlord said, when you have the baby, you have to get out. It's blatant housing discrimination. And the Fair Housing Center, by the way, is an incredible organization. They do high impact work. They are not afraid to file lawsuits and pick fights with the big dogs. I mean, they are a really cool organization. And we only have one in the state of Indiana. I think Ohio's got 6 nonprofit fair housing organizations. The Fair Housing Center of Central Indiana is the only one in Indiana, and it's not very old either.
Chase, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Related? I think there was an example in the book. I think it was Crystal and Vanetta, maybe, and they had gone to look at an apartment, and the person showing them the apartment like took out his cell phone and acted like, oh, the deal's already been done, and they felt, I think they described, that they felt that was discriminatory. But how do you prove that? Like, how does it? How does calling that Fair Housing Center? How do they have any evidence of that? And how do people afford to then wait out that process when they need immediate housing anyways?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Megan. You might find this interesting. If you go to their website, the Fair Housing Center, they have a media center where they have some of their reports. They did a rental study a few years ago where they recruited testers, and they went around and determined basically if you were a person of color, you'd be quoted a higher rental amount or security deposit, or you wouldn't be shown all the amenities at the property, stuff like that. It's more subversive to the point of your question. It's not always, I'm not renting to you because you look the way you do. It's, I'm going to tell you there's no apartments available, and you may have no idea that I discriminated against you. So the way they do it is if they get a complaint, they'll hire, and maybe they get multiple complaints, they'll hire testers to go basically gather the evidence that that particular housing provider is discriminating. And that's how they build their case. And that's the kind of stuff that we talk about at board meetings before they file cases. So really good question. I'm going to move along here. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Just thank you. I was
curious
with the tester is an interesting.
No, I'm really glad you asked that. Fantastic question. In chapter 21, Doreen chooses not to call Sharina when the house was in desperate need of repair. What effects does living in a home that's not decent or functional have on a person's psychological and emotional health? How many of you have ever lost heat in your house before? Have you ever lost heat in the middle of winter? I'd say the most stress I've ever experienced is losing heat in the middle of winter, right? We had a heat pump that was non-functional for months and it would go out constantly. And I got to tell you, the second or third time, the fourth time it goes out and you think you're crazy that there's cold air coming out of the vents and all that kind of stuff, it's that can really take a toll on you. But what some of these folks are dealing with is much more severe than that even, right? The example in the book, I think it was the Hingston family, where they were dealing with the plumbing situation, where it stopped up the bathroom, their kitchen. They basically just stopped doing the dishes. The place becomes cluttered and littered with trash. The kids' grades start dropping. The teacher's calling saying your kid's gonna have to retake their grade in class. Everybody stopped cleaning up. It seemed to really take a psychological toll on that family. I'm curious if you guys remember any other examples in the book. That's the one that stuck out to me in particular.
I don't remember a specific example, but it said it affected their self-worth.
Trent, we can't hear you too well. It might be the.
Can you hear me better now?
Yes. Yep. There
Okay.
you go.
I don't remember a specific example, but I remember them saying that it affected their self-worth.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably not one of those things you really understand unless you're living in it. But with the Hingston family, you could see how it played out in the rest of their lives. It wasn't just the sink doesn't work in the kitchen and the bathroom's always clogged up too. It became, well, we're not going to ask for repairs. We're worried she's going to retaliate against us. So I guess we're just going to live in this despair pretty much, which is a pretty difficult place to be. So we get to this question of what does the Bible say about disparity and injustice? I want to make sure to cover this. So Tim Keller, you might have heard that name if you follow any Christian writers and things like that. But he wrote in a biblical critique of secular justice and critical theory that while we're not to show partiality to any, we are to have special concern for the powerless, right? And he cites some Bible verses. Isaiah 1:17, learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. Blessed is he who has regard for the weak. The Lord delivers him in times of trouble. Proverbs 31:8-9 says, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, defend the rights of the poor and needy. The Bible doesn't say speak up for the rich and powerful. And he goes out of his way to point out it's not because that people who have money or have more power are less important as people before God, but because they don't need people to stick up for them, right? There isn't a disparity of power on their side of the fence. So the playing field is not level, and if we don't advocate for the poor, there will not be equality. So in this aspect of justice, we are seeking to give more social, financial, and cultural capital to those with less so that we have a more equitable society. So I think that's a really apt observation. So we talked about this a little bit, but many people have a perception. This I think is the other really key thing about the book. If you don't take anything away from it other than this shift in perspective, many people have a perception of people who get evicted and suspect that those people are largely responsible because of their decision making for their bad circumstances. Did you feel this way before reading Evicted? Why or why not? And did it change after reading the book? And if so, how did that change?
Chase, I can go. I was just going to say that I read this at a time when I was volunteering at a shelter in DC, and it was a women's shelter. And I would talk to the women, you know, before I did that, I never really thought about poverty as like a personal responsibility, but I didn't have a full understanding of how people could end up homeless or end up evicted. And then you start talking to people and you realize that they could not find a safe or affordable place to live. A lot of them worked, a lot of them had families, they had full lives, they just didn't have housing. So yeah, I think this book just further solidified that, you know, poverty is truly a systemic moral failing of a society.
Thanks for that observation, Kyle. That's really astute. Anyone else? I know we're coming up on time here, but does anybody else have an observation or how this book changed your way of thinking about this personal responsibility aspect of poverty and eviction?
I'm definitely, yeah, this is Jaleesa. Guys, I have to definitely echo what was just mentioned. So in my field, I'm in human resources, and a lot of our employees that we deal with don't necessarily come forth and say that, you know, they have an issue with eviction, but, you know, we're trained to provide them with resources where they can seek help and assistance with housing and whatnot. But I got to be honest, this definitely changed my perspective tremendously, because working in the field that I work in, we try to obviously mitigate risk with the company, but we always want to make sure that we're being compassionate and empathetic towards our employees. So this just really changed my mindset in just being, you know, I guess as I'm training managers and directors on how to address certain issues, to remember the compassionate side of, because we really don't know what an employee is going through, right? And we sense things, and we don't typically ask a lot of questions just because we just don't want to cross that line. But I mean, it's evident that it is a problem, and this book definitely has helped me personally open my eyes to those issues. And as a manager and trying to train others, is to really just keep in mind that we really don't know what that other person is going through, and just to continue to hold compassion and empathy for them.
That's awesome. Thank you for that. You're sharing your perspective. That's really great. Ryan, did you have something? And then I think we'll kind of wrap up here.
Yeah, I would agree with what's been mentioned. This was a real eye-opening and revealing look. I think the power of it was just the narrative aspect. I tried to look at all the footnotes, and then some of those my eyes kind of gloss over because he's citing, studies and all that sort of stuff. But the narrative thrust of what he's documenting of people's stories, that was hugely impactful. So I think it was revealing to me just from our systems are broken in many cases. And then if you broaden that out the scope, you could say, I would argue at least society is largely broken. And then if you kind of take that down from the 30,000 foot view, and you look at an individual perspective and you say, I think we as people are largely broken as well. We are the victims of the brokenness of others. And sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, we victimize others. So it just, for me, it was really helpful perspective gaining opportunity to read. And it just helped me think in terms of those three different levels of systems, society, and individuals.
That's great. Thank you, Ryan. Yeah, I think that not only the shift in perspective, but also particularly in the epilogue when he gets into, I think those are some of the most powerful things where he's talking about housing policy in general and how it's shifted over time and what direction it could be going and what are some great ideas. And Kyle talked about, universal vouchers and some of these other ideas. And I think it's just a matter of educating yourself on those topics and electing people who have good ideas around housing because of the importance that it has in our society as a whole. I did want to let's see, take you to the end here. There are a few local organizations, some that have a statewide presence, some that are more local that I wanted you all to be aware of. Some of the book study questions and materials, I want to give credit to these organizations. The Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition actually has a book study that they came up with that's structured over time. But you can look that up on their website and download it for like a more intensive, like small group study or something like that, if you would want to. But yeah, I just want to thank you all for being here tonight. I think it was a really engaging discussion. I'm glad you all took the time to read some or all of the book, and hope that you enjoyed it as much as I did. And a special thank you to Kyle as well for taking his time to join us and be part of this this experience. So I hope you found it to be a positive one, and thank you all for taking some of your evening to spend with us. I think it was a really good evening. Lydia, did you have anything you wanted to plug or let folks know about that's coming up?
Plug is a great word, Chase. Thank you so much for asking. So thank you again to Chase and Kyle. That was an amazing presentation, both of you, and great discussion, everyone. Thank you for being so engaging. I do want to plug two similar events that we have coming up. One that was just announced today for the very first time. You're going to get a little more information in the email I'm about to send you. But of course, we have one more Power Disparities session on April 8th, which is on reentry from the criminal justice system. We'll be studying Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, which some of you may have read. And so those tickets are available the same place you got these tickets, nclegalclinic.org/events, where you'll be able to find all of our upcoming events. And then the other one is the newly released event, which is a garden-related fundraiser. We're trying something kind of out of the box, random, but still trying to show the ties between gardening, urban gardening, community gardens, and the promotion of justice in our community. And actually during this event, you'll be able to plant seeds, which will ship you in the mail, plant seeds along with us via Zoom, and also learn some pro gardening tips from local experts from Helpings of Hope, Inc., which is in Indianapolis. And you'll also get some other fun resources that we'll mail you in advance too. So kind of a random out of the box event, but another great conversation, I'm sure, with the two guest speakers we'll have. So hope you're able to make it to that. That one is on Wednesday, March 24th in the evening as well. So again, I'm about to send you an email with those little bullet points as well, but feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. And please, as always, help us spread the word about these events. We really rely on word of mouth to spread the word and get more people engaged with the clinic. So thank you all so much for your time. And I think that's it. If anyone wants to just hang out and continue the conversation, we can probably stay on for a little bit. Otherwise, have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Lydia, I just wanted to say, if anyone wants to reach, I put my email in the chat. Please feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to learn from you all as well. You are out in the field doing a lot of good work, so feel free to reach out to me and let me know if there's anything interesting you're working on or anything you'd like highlighted. So thanks again.
Thanks, Kyle. That sounds great.
Thank you, Kyle.